In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling silence falls as Master Clockmaker Elias Thorne is found murdered in his locked workshop, a bloodied pendulum weight by his side. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster whose knack for unraveling secrets sets her on a trail of clues. 4 suspects: Tom, the ambitious apprentice; Clara, the greedy collector; Gideon, the envious rival; and Evelyn, the nosy neighbor, each hide motives tied to Thorne's revolutionary Chronos design. As whispers of theft and betrayal tick through the village, Miss Marple's keen mind winds through a maze of deception, revealing a killer driven by desperation in a race against time. Chapter 1. The Ticking Silence. The village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the soft golden light of an autumn morning, its cottages and hedgerows touched with the crisp promise of October. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and the usual hum of village life: children scampering to school, the baker's cart rattling along the cobbled lane, proceeded with its comforting predictability. Yet, in the heart of this serene tableau, a subtle discord had emerged, one that Miss Jane Marple, seated by her lace-curtained window with her knitting, detected with the keen instinct of a woman long accustomed to the rhythms of her neighbors. Miss Marple's cottage, perched at the edge of the village green, afforded her a view of St. Mary Mead's comings and goings. Her needles clicked softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl, her eyes occasionally lifting to note the milkman's late delivery or the vicar's hurried stride toward the church. But today, her attention lingered on the absence of a familiar sound, the melodic chime of Elias Thorne's clocks, which typically echoed from his workshop at the stroke of 9. The church clock had tolled the hour alone, its solitary peal hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. "Most curious," she murmured to herself, setting her knitting aside. Elias Thorne, the village clockmaker, was a figure of quiet renown in St. Mary Mead. His workshop, a narrow building tucked between the butcher's and Miss Price's cottage, was a marvel of ticking precision. Clocks of every description, grandfather clocks with stately pendulums, delicate mantel clocks with filigreed hands, and curious contraptions of his own design, filled the space, their synchronized ticking a testament to Thorne's skill. He was a reserved man, nearing 60, with a shock of white hair and spectacles perpetually perched on his nose, known for his meticulous craft and a stubborn refusal to compromise on quality. The villagers spoke of him with a mixture of pride and exasperation, for while his clocks were exquisite, his prices were not for the faint of purse. By 11 o'clock, the village was abuzz with a graver rumor. Miss Marple, sipping tea with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, learned the details from young Tommy Pierce, who had run from the workshop with wide eyes and a breathless tale. Elias Thorne had been found dead at his workbench, discovered by his apprentice, Tom Weaver, when he arrived to open the shop. The news spread like wildfire, drawing a small crowd to the workshop's doorstep, where Constable Reed, a sturdy man with a penchant for order, was attempting to maintain decorum. Miss Marple, invited by Mrs. Clement to offer her calming presence, made her way to the scene. The workshop's door stood ajar, revealing a glimpse of its chaotic interior. Gears and springs glinting in the morning light, a half-finished clock on the bench, and, most chillingly, the still form of Elias Thorne. He was slumped forward, his head resting on a pile of sketches, a jeweler's loop clutched in his right hand, as if frozen in mid-examination. A heavy brass pendulum weight, its surface marred with dark stains, lay on the floor beside him, a silent witness to the violence that had ended his life. Constable Reed, his notebook in hand, was addressing the gathered villagers with a mixture of authority and unease. "No one's to touch anything," he declared, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This is a murder, plain as day. The door was locked from the inside, key still in it, and no windows forced. We'll get to the bottom of this, mark my words." His confidence, however, was tempered by the complexity of the scene, and Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively at the edge of the crowd, noted the faint crease in his brow. She stepped closer, her black lace-up shoes silent on the cobbles, and peered into the workshop. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood and oil, undercut by a faint metallic tang. The single window, high and narrow, admitted a sliver of light that fell across Thorne's workbench, illuminating a crumpled sketch of an intricate clock mechanism. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A murder in a locked room, a craftsman of rare talent, and a village full of secrets. Here was a puzzle that demanded her attention. "Poor Mr. Thorne," she said softly, turning to Mrs. Clement. "Such a dreadful thing. I suppose I ought to call at the workshop later to collect that little clock I ordered. It would be only proper, don't you think?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, betrayed a curiosity that belied her years. As she returned to her cottage, the village clock struck noon, its chime a somber reminder of the silence that now enveloped Elias Thorne's workshop. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and settled back into her chair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from idle. The ticking of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted, and she intended to discover why. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled high street of St. Mary Mead, its golden rays doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the village. The news of Elias Thorne's murder had spread like a ripple in a pond, stirring whispers and sidelong glances among the villagers. By 2 o'clock, the small stone workshop, its windows now darkened, had become the epicenter of curiosity. A small crowd lingered at a respectful distance, their murmurs blending with the rustle of autumn leaves. Inside, Constable Reed, a sturdy man with a penchant for order but little flair for imagination, had cordoned off the premises with a length of rope and a stern demeanor. His men, 2 young constables from the county station, stood guard, their faces betraying a mix of duty and unease. Miss Jane Marple, her basket tucked under her arm, made her way to the vicarage, where Dolly Bantry had insisted she join the gathering of those closest to the tragedy. "It's only right, Jane," Dolly had said, her eyes bright with the thrill of drama. "The vicar's opened his parlor to offer solace, and everyone will be there, everyone who matters, that is." Miss Marple had nodded, her expression one of quiet acquiescence, though her mind was already turning over the threads of the puzzle. She knew the vicarage parlor, with its faded chintz and overstuffed armchairs, would be a stage for more than condolences. People, she had long observed, revealed themselves most when they believed themselves unobserved, and a murder in St. Mary Mead was certain to loosen tongues and betray secrets. The vicarage, a rambling old house with ivy clinging to its walls, stood a short walk from the high street. As Miss Marple entered, she was greeted by the vicar, Mr. Clement, a gentle soul whose sermons were earnest but seldom stirring. He clasped her hand warmly, his brow creased with concern. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said. "Poor Mr. Thorne, a man of such skill, taken so cruelly." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, her eyes scanning the room. The parlor was already crowded, the air thick with the scent of tea and the low hum of conversation. Dolly, ever the hostess, bustled about with a tray of cups, her energy a stark contrast to the somber mood. At the center of the room stood the four individuals who had become, by virtue of their proximity to the crime, the focus of village speculation. Miss Marple settled into a corner chair, her knitting retrieved from her basket as a shield for her observations. She had always found that a pair of needles and a skein of wool made people forget her presence, allowing her to watch and listen undisturbed. Her gaze moved from one suspect to the next, noting their postures, their gestures, the flickers of emotion that crossed their faces. Tom Weaver, the apprentice, slouched by the fireplace, his lanky frame ill at ease in the formal setting. His hands, stained with the oil and grime of the workshop, fidgeted with the cuff of his worn jacket. At 19, he was all angles and uncertainty, his dark eyes darting about the room as if seeking an escape. Miss Marple recalled seeing him often in the village, trailing behind Thorne with a mixture of awe and frustration. He had been with the Clockmaker for 2 years, learning the trade, but there was talk of his ambition outstripping his patience. His alibi, she had heard from Dolly, was shaky at best. A late night at the Red Lion, confirmed only by a barmaid whose memory was clouded by cider. Across the room, Mrs. Clara Henshaw held court from a high-backed chair, her mourning attire as impeccable as her reputation for sharp dealing. A widow of considerable means, she had a passion for collecting rare timepieces, and Thorne's workshop had been her frequent haunt. Her face, framed by a severe black bonnet, was set in an expression of calculated grief, but her eyes, sharp and appraising, missed nothing. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's gloved fingers toyed with a gold locket, a nervous habit that belied her composed exterior. Dolly had whispered that Clara had been at the workshop the previous evening, arguing with Thorne over the price of a rare clock. A woman of her temperament, Miss Marple mused, might not take kindly to refusal. Mr. Gideon Blackwood, the rival clockmaker from Upper Wren, stood apart, his broad shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight. His face, weathered by years of labor and disappointment, bore the marks of a man who had tasted success, but never its fullness. His clocks, though competent, lacked the artistry of Thorne's, and the rivalry between the two men was the stuff of local legend. Gideon's presence in St. Mary Mead the previous evening had raised eyebrows, for he seldom ventured from his own shop without reason. His wife, a timid woman with a habit of wringing her hands, had let slip to the butcher that Gideon had taken a late walk, returning with mud on his boots. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him, noting the way his jaw tightened when Thorne's name was mentioned. Miss Evelyn Price, the neighbor, perched on the edge of a sofa, her thin frame vibrating with nervous energy. Her cottage shared a wall with Thorne's workshop, and her garden offered a clear view of its comings and goings. She was a spinster of indeterminate age, her face sharp and bird-like, her eyes bright with the zeal of one who thrived on the village's secrets. She had already begun to recount her observations to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. I saw them all, you know, she said to Mrs. Bantry, her tone laced with self-importance. Tom leaving just past 8, Mrs. Henshaw before that, and Mr. Blackwood lingering near the shop at 9. And then, later, there was a shadow in my garden. Oh, it gave me such a fright. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind filing away Evelyn's words. A shadow, she thought, could mean many things, but it was a detail worth pursuing. The room was a study in contrasts. Tom's restless unease, Clara's calculated poise, Gideon's brooding intensity, and Evelyn's eager chatter. Each, in their way, seemed touched by the shadow of Thorne's death, and Miss Marple knew that beneath their facades lay motives yet to be uncovered. She sipped her tea, her expression one of mild interest, but her mind was as precise as the clocks Thorne had crafted. Human nature, she had long observed, was like a clock's mechanism. Each part moved in concert, driven by springs of desire, fear, or envy. To find the truth, one needed only to trace the gears back to their source. Constable Reed entered the parlor, his notebook in hand, his face flushed with the weight of his task. "I'll need to speak with each of you," he announced, his voice gruff but uncertain. "We're treating this as a murder, and no one's to leave the village until we've got to the bottom of it." A murmur of protest rose from the group, but Miss Marple noted their reactions with care. Tom's eyes widened, his fingers twisting a loose thread on his cuff. Clara's lips tightened, her hand stilling on her locket. Gideon's gaze dropped to the floor, his fists clenching briefly. Evelyn, predictably, leaned forward, her face alight with curiosity. "Oh, Constable," she said, "I'll tell you everything I saw. It's my duty, after all." Miss Marple set her cup down, her movements deliberate. She had no official role in the investigation, but she knew Constable Reed would welcome her insights, however reluctantly. He was a man of method, not intuition, and the locked door of the workshop puzzled him. "A queer business," he had muttered to Dolly earlier. "Locked from the inside, key still in the door, and that pendulum weight, far too heavy for the clocks in the shop." Miss Marple had nodded, her mind already turning over the details. A locked room, she knew, was not always what it seemed. She recalled a case in her youth when a village girl had staged a theft by locking herself in a pantry, only to slip out through a hidden panel. The principle, she suspected, might apply here. Dolly, ever eager to keep the conversation flowing, approached Miss Marple with a fresh pot of tea. "What do you make of it, Jane?" she whispered, her eyes darting toward the suspects. 4 of them, all with reasons to wish Thorne ill. Tom wanted his secrets, Clara wanted his clocks, Gideon wanted his trade, and Evelyn, well, she's just too nosy for her own good. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. "People are seldom what they seem, Dolly," she said softly, "but they do leave traces, like the hands of a clock marking time." As the afternoon wore on, the parlor grew warmer, the air heavy with unspoken tensions. Tom excused himself to fetch a glass of water, his steps quick and uneven. Clara engaged the vicar in a discussion of Thorne's craftsmanship, her voice carrying a note of proprietary pride. Gideon remained silent, his eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, while Evelyn continued her litany of observations, each detail embellished with her own flair. Miss Marple listened, her mind sorting the fragments of their stories. She thought of the workshop, its single high window overlooking Evelyn's garden, the complex lock on the door, the bloodied pendulum weight that seemed so out of place. And then there was the sketch Dolly had mentioned in passing, a crumpled drawing on Thorne's workbench, labeled The Chronos. It was a detail that tugged at her, like a loose thread in her knitting. She resolved to visit the workshop herself, under the guise of retrieving a clock she had commissioned from Thorne. Constable Reed, she knew, would permit it, if only to humor an old lady. But Miss Marple was no mere busybody. She had seen too many village dramas, too many secrets hidden in plain sight, to dismiss the smallest clue. The gathering of suspects, she knew, was only the beginning. Each had a story, and each story held a piece of the truth. It was her task to fit those pieces together, to find the rhythm that would set the village's clock ticking once more. As she rose to leave, her basket in hand, she caught Tom's eye. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She smiled, her expression one of gentle concern, but her mind was already at work. The gathering of suspects had revealed much, but it was in the quiet moments, the unnoticed gestures, that the truth would begin to emerge. With a final nod to Dolly, she stepped out into the fading light, her steps as measured as the tick of a clock, her thoughts already turning to the workshop and the secrets it held. Chapter 3. The Workshop's Secrets. The late afternoon light filtered through the elms lining St. Mary Mead's High Street, casting dappled shadows on the cobblestones as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Elias Thorne's workshop. The village, though outwardly calm, hummed with the undercurrent of unease that follows a violent death. Shopkeepers lingered in their doorways, exchanging hushed theories, while children darted past, their games tinged with the thrill of the village's dark news. Miss Marple, her basket swinging lightly at her side, wore the serene expression of one merely running an errand. But her pale blue eyes were alert, taking in every detail of the scene. The workshop, a squat stone building with a slate roof, stood at the end of the street, its sign, a gilt clock face with the words, E. Thorne, Horologist, swaying gently in the breeze. Constable Reed had stationed a young officer at the door, a lanky lad named Perkins, who nodded respectfully as Miss Marple approached. "I've come to inquire about a clock I'd commissioned," she said, her voice soft and unassuming. "Mr. Thorne was to adjust its chime for me. Might I have a look, Constable?" Perkins hesitated, then stepped aside, muttering something about checking with Reed. Miss Marple's reputation for harmlessness worked its usual magic, and soon she was inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The interior of the workshop was a marvel, a labyrinth of timekeeping that seemed to hold the very pulse of the village. Shelves lined the walls, laden with clocks of every description, delicate mantel clocks with porcelain faces, sturdy oak regulators, and a towering grandfather clock whose pendulum swung with a solemn thud. The air smelled of polished wood, machine oil, and the faint metallic tang of brass. Workbenches stretched along one wall, cluttered with gears, springs, and tools so fine they might have been a jeweler's. At the far end, a high, narrow window admitted a sliver of light, illuminating the workbench where Elias Thorne had met his end. Miss Marple paused, her gaze settling on the scene of the crime. The workbench was a chaos of creation, strewn with half-assembled mechanisms and scraps of paper. A jeweler's loop lay beside a small vise, as if Thorne had been interrupted mid-task. The bloodied pendulum weight, now removed by Constable Reed's men, had left a faint stain on the wooden surface, a grim reminder of the violence that had intruded here. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over the details she'd gleaned from Dolly Bantry. The door, locked from the inside with the key still in place, suggested no one had entered or left by conventional means. Yet the pendulum weight, heavy and ornate, belonged to a clock far grander than any in the shop, a discrepancy that tugged at her curiosity. She moved closer, her eyes scanning the workbench. Among the clutter, a crumpled sheet of paper caught her attention. It was a detailed sketch, rendered in Thorne's precise hand, depicting a clock unlike any she had seen. Its face was an intricate lattice of gears, designed to move in a pattern that seemed almost otherworldly. At the top, in a neat script, was the word Chronos. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the paper, careful not to touch it. She noted a faint pencil mark in the margin, a series of numbers, perhaps a measurement or a code. The Chronos, she sensed, was no ordinary design. It held a significance that might explain the desperation that led to murder. Stepping back, she turned her attention to the room itself. The floor, worn smooth by years of Thorne's pacing, bore no obvious signs of a struggle, though a faint scuff near the window caught her eye. The window itself, set high in the wall, overlooked Miss Evelyn Price's garden, its sill just wide enough to suggest a precarious perch. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. A ladder, perhaps, or a nimble intruder could have used it as an entry point, though the height and narrowness made it unlikely for a casual thief. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a boy had climbed a drainpipe to steal apples from a neighbor's tree, only to leave a telltale scratch on the wall. The principle, she thought, might apply here. The door's lock drew her next. It was a masterpiece of Thorne's own design, a complex mechanism that required a key as unique as a fingerprint. Miss Marple bent closer, her spectacles glinting in the dim light. The key, still in the lock, was unmarred, and the surrounding wood showed no signs of tampering. Yet the idea of a locked room did not daunt her. She had seen too many such puzzles in her time, doors locked to conceal, not to protect. Her mind flitted to the vicarage's old pantry, where a maid had once hidden stolen silver, locking herself inside to deflect suspicion. The trick, Miss Marple knew, lay in understanding the lock's purpose. She moved to the shelves, her fingers brushing lightly against a row of clock faces, each a testament to Thorne's artistry. One clock, a small brass piece with a moon phase dial, was slightly askew, its base misaligned with the others. She nudged it gently, revealing a faint outline in the dust, a rectangular shape, as if something had been removed. A notebook, perhaps, or a box? The absence intrigued her, for Thorne was a man of meticulous habits, unlikely to leave his workspace in disarray. As she continued her inspection, Constable Reed entered, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Find what you needed, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone a mix of deference and impatience. She smiled, holding up her basket. "Not quite, Constable, but I'll have Tom look into my clock when things settle." Poor Mr. Thorne, such a loss to the village. Reed nodded, his face softening. "Aye, a queer business. That weight doesn't fit any clock here, and the locked door's got me stumped. No footprints outside either, save for Miss Price's garden, but that's all trampled from her weeding." Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. "Her garden, you say? That would be the one beneath the window?" Reed confirmed with a nod, unaware of the spark he'd ignited. She thanked him and stepped outside, pausing to glance at the garden next door. Miss Price's marigolds, usually pristine, were indeed disturbed, their stems bent as if trodden upon. A ladder leaned against her shed, its rungs worn but sturdy, and Miss Marple's mind began to weave a possibility. The window, the ladder, the trampled flowers, each was a gear in the mechanism of the crime, waiting to be aligned. As she walked back to Danemead Cottage, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts were far from idle. The workshop had revealed more than she'd expected. The Kronos sketch, with its promise of innovation, the misplaced pendulum weight, an instrument of death that did not belong. The high window, a silent witness to an intruder's path. She thought of the suspects, Tom's ambition, Clara's greed, Gideon's envy, Evelyn's watchfulness, and how each might fit into the puzzle. The Kronos, she suspected, was the key. A creation, valuable enough to stir the darkest impulses. Like a clock's escapement, regulating the release of energy, the truth would emerge tick by tick, if only she could find the right rhythm. Back in her parlor, she settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a backdrop to her reflections. The workshop's secrets were many, but Miss Marple knew that secrets, like clocks, could not run forever. They required winding, and she was determined to turn the key. Chapter 4. The Apprentice's Tale. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, lending the village an air of quiet secrecy, as Miss Jane Marple set out for the Weaver household. The high street was subdued, its usual bustle tempered by the shadow of Elias Thorne's murder. The villagers, though eager for news, kept their voices low, as if the very air might carry their words to the wrong ears. Miss Marple, her basket tucked under her arm, wore a plain tweed coat and a knitted scarf, her appearance as unremarkable as ever. Yet her mind was anything but idle, turning over the details of the workshop, the Kronos sketch, the misplaced pendulum weight, the trampled marigolds beneath the window. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the crime, and today she intended to tug at one in particular, the story of Tom Weaver, the apprentice. The Weaver cottage, a modest dwelling with a sagging thatch roof, stood at the edge of the village, its garden a riot of late-blooming roses. Mrs. Weaver, a wiry woman with hands roughened by years of laundry work, welcomed Miss Marple with a nervous smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's kind of you to call," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've a recipe for that lemon drizzle cake you liked at the church fete, if you've come for it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle interest, though her true purpose was to observe Tom, who had been summoned to the police station earlier that morning. "That would be lovely, Mrs. Weaver," she replied, settling into a worn armchair by the hearth. "And how is Tom faring, with all this trouble?" Mrs. Weaver's face clouded, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "He's shaken, miss. He looked up to Mr. Thorne, you know, like a father. But the constable's questions have him all aflutter. He's not himself." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her needles clicking as she drew her knitting from her basket. She had long found that the rhythm of knitting put others at ease, loosening tongues that might otherwise remain guarded. "It's a dreadful thing," she said, "to lose such a mentor. Tom must have spent many hours in that workshop." "Oh, aye," Mrs. Weaver said, bustling to fetch the recipe from a tin box. "He was there till all hours, learning the trade. Mr. Thorne was teaching him a new escapement, something clever with gears. Tom was that excited about it, said it could make a clock keep time like nothing else. Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the door. But he's been moody of late, talking of opening his own shop one day. Mr. Thorne wasn't keen, said Tom wasn't ready. I told him to be patient, but you know how young lads are. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but keen. Ambition, she knew, could be a powerful force, especially in a young man eager to prove himself. She recalled a boy in the village years ago, a gardener's apprentice who'd stolen tools to start his own plot, only to be undone by his own impatience. Tom, she suspected, was not so different, though theft was one thing and murder quite another. Did he speak of anything specific? She asked, her tone light. A particular clock, perhaps, that Mr. Thorne was working on? Mrs. Weaver hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. He mentioned something called the Master's Secret. Said Mr. Thorne kept it locked away, wouldn't let Tom near it. I thought it was just shop talk, but Tom was proper put out. Said it was a design that could change everything. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind latching onto the phrase. The chronos, she thought, the sketch on the workbench. It was no coincidence that Tom's words echoed the name scrawled in Thorne's hand. Before she could press further, the door creaked open, and Tom himself entered, his lanky frame stooped with fatigue. His dark eyes, shadowed with worry, flickered toward Miss Marple, then away. "Mother," he said, his voice low, "Constable Reed's done with me for now." Mrs. Weaver hurried to him, her hands fluttering like anxious birds. "Oh, Tom, what did you tell them?" she asked, guiding him to a chair. Miss Marple observed him closely, noting the oil stains on his fingers, the faint tremor in his hands. "It must have been trying, Tom," she said gently, her needles resuming their rhythm. "To speak of such a loss. You were with Mr. Thorne late, I hear?" Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Till 8 or so," he muttered. "We were working on a new escapement. I left to meet a mate at the Red Lion, got home by 10. His words were clipped, rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept up his neck. "The Red Lion," she said, as if musing aloud. "A lively place, I'm told. Your friend must have been glad of your company." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his fingers picking at a loose thread on his trouser leg. "Aye, Will Harper. He'll tell you I was there." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was cataloging the details. Will Harper, she knew, was a lad of dubious reliability, often found in his cups by evening's end. An alibi dependent on such a witness was fragile at best. Mrs. Weaver, sensing the tension, offered tea, and Miss Marple accepted, using the moment to steer the conversation. "Mr. Thorne's clocks were quite remarkable," she said, her tone conversational. "I saw a sketch in the workshop yesterday, a curious design labeled Chronos. Did you ever see it, Tom?" His head snapped up, a flicker of alarm in his eyes before he masked it with a shrug. "Might have," he said. "The master had lots of sketches, kept the best ones locked in his desk." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his reaction. The desk, she recalled, had been locked when she visited the workshop, its key nowhere in sight. As Mrs. Weaver poured tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader picture. Tom's ambition, his frustration with Thorne's secrecy, pointed to a motive, but motive alone was not enough. The locked door, the high window, the heavy pendulum weight, all suggested a crime of opportunity, not premeditation. Yet Tom's nervous demeanor, his evasive glances, hinted at something unspoken. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a young man had lied about a trivial theft, his guilt betrayed not by his words, but by his inability to meet her eyes. Tom, she decided, bore watching, but her instincts whispered that the truth lay deeper, entwined with the Chronos and its promise of glory. She rose, thanking Mrs. Weaver for the recipe, and offering Tom a sympathetic smile. "You'll carry on Mr. Thorne's work, I'm sure," she said. "He'd have been proud of your skill." Tom mumbled a reply, his eyes still averted, and Miss Marple stepped out into the mist, her mind alight with possibilities. The apprentice's tale was incomplete, a mechanism missing a crucial gear. As she walked back to Danemead Cottage, the village clock struck noon, its chime a solitary echo in the absence of Thorne's workshop. Miss Marple tightened her scarf, her thoughts already turning to the next thread in the tapestry, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, whose passion for clocks might conceal a darker desire. Chapter 5. The Buyer's Bargain. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, painting the rooftops with a warm amber glow that did little to soften the chill of suspicion now gripping the village. Miss Jane Marple, her basket neatly packed with her knitting and the lemon drizzle recipe from Mrs. Weaver, made her way toward the imposing gates of Henshaw Manor. The grand house, set back from the high street behind a curtain of ancient yews, was a testament to the wealth of its mistress, Mrs. Clara Henshaw. A widow of some years, Clara was known for her discerning taste and unyielding will, qualities that had made her both admired and feared in equal measure. Miss Marple, her steps measured and her expression one of polite curiosity, had secured an invitation for tea under the pretext of discussing a church fundraiser. In truth, she sought to unravel the thread of Clara's connection to Elias Thorne's death. The manor's oak door swung open to reveal a maid, a young woman with a nervous bob and eyes that darted toward the shadows of the hall. "Mrs. Henshaw's expecting you, miss," she said, ushering Miss Marple into a drawing-room that gleamed with polished mahogany and the soft tick of clocks. The walls were adorned with Thorne's creations, mantel clocks with filigree hands, a gilt carriage clock with a chime like a silver bell, and a rare astronomical clock that tracked the stars with eerie precision. Each was a masterpiece, a silent chorus of timekeeping that spoke of Clara's obsession. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them, noting their pristine condition, as if each had been cherished like a jewel. Clara Henshaw entered with the air of a queen, her black morning dress rustling softly, her silver hair pinned beneath a lace cap. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "How kind of you to call in such troubling times." She gestured to a velvet-upholstered chair, her gloved hand lingering on a gold locket that hung at her throat. Miss Marple settled into the seat, her knitting drawn from her basket as a familiar prop, its gentle rhythm a counterpoint to the tension in the room. "A dreadful loss, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone soft but deliberate. "His clocks were the heart of the village, were they not?" Clara's lips tightened, though her smile remained. "Indeed, Elias was a genius, though a stubborn one. His work graces my home, as you see." She waved a hand toward the clocks, her pride unmistakable. "I had hoped to acquire another before this tragedy." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "I heard you visited him that evening," she said, her voice light, as if merely passing on village gossip. "Something about a rare piece, perhaps?" Clara's fingers paused on her locket, a flicker of wariness crossing her face before she masked it with a sigh. Yes, I was there. Around 6, I believe. Elias had promised me first refusal on a new clock, a singular design he called the Chronos. It was to be his masterpiece, or so he claimed. But his price was exorbitant, far beyond reason. Her tone grew sharp, a hint of the indignation she'd felt. We argued. I won't deny it. I left by 7, and my maid, Ellen, can confirm I was home thereafter. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and unassuming, noted the slight tremor in Clara's hand as she spoke. A woman of such pride, she thought, would not easily forgive a slight, nor relinquish a prize she coveted. She recalled a lady in St. Mary Mead years ago, who'd haggled fiercely over a set of porcelain figurines, only to harbor a grudge when outbid. Clara's passion for clocks was no mere hobby. It was a hunger, and the Chronos, with its promise of unparalleled craftsmanship, would have been a jewel in her collection. It must have been disappointing, Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, to come so close to such a treasure. Clara's gaze sharpened, as if sensing a probe beneath the words, but she nodded. It was. Elias could be maddeningly obstinate. He spoke of the Chronos as if it were his legacy, not to be sold lightly. I offered a fair sum, but he refused to budge. She leaned back, her composure restored. Still, I wouldn't harm him over it. I have enough of his clocks to satisfy me. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Clara's words. The Chronos, again, its name a recurring note in the symphony of the case. She thought of the sketch in the workshop, its intricate design a testament to Thorne's genius. A woman like Clara, accustomed to getting her way, might not take kindly to refusal, especially if the prize was as rare as she claimed. Yet murder required more than pique. It required a coldness. Miss Marple was not yet certain Clara possessed. The maid, Ellen, entered with a tea tray, her movements careful but unsteady. Miss Marple noted the girl's pale face, the way her eyes flicked toward her mistress before settling on the floor. "Thank you, Ellen," Clara said, her tone dismissive. As the maid retreated, Miss Marple seized the moment. "Your maid must be a great comfort," she said, "to confirm your return home that evening. It's such a help to have reliable staff." Clara nodded, but her fingers tightened on her locket, a gesture Miss Marple filed away. Ellen's testimony, she suspected, would bear scrutiny, for loyalty could be bought or coerced. The conversation turned to the fundraiser, a safe topic that allowed Miss Marple to observe Clara further. The widow's poise was impeccable, her manners those of a woman who knew her place in the world and expected others to acknowledge it. Yet there was a brittleness to her, a tension that betrayed itself in the way her eyes darted to the clocks, as if seeking reassurance in their steady ticks. Miss Marple thought of the workshop's locked door, the high window, the heavy pendulum weight. Could Clara, with her wealth and determination, have orchestrated such a crime? The idea seemed fanciful, yet Miss Marple knew that greed, like a spring wound too tight, could drive even the most refined to desperate acts. As tea was poured, Miss Marple steered the conversation back to Thorne. "His workshop was a marvel," she said, her tone wistful. "So many tools, such precision. I noticed a sketch on his bench, the Chronos, I believe. It seemed quite extraordinary." Clara's cup paused midway to her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you?" she said, her voice cool. "Elias was secretive about it. He said it would revolutionize timekeeping, but he wouldn't show me the details. A pity, really." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the response. Clara's interest in the Chronos was no surprise, but her guarded tone suggested more than mere disappointment. Had she seen the sketch before, perhaps during her argument with Thorn? Or was her knowledge second-hand, gleaned from village gossip? Miss Marple recalled a case in her youth when a collector had forged a will to secure a rare painting, only to be undone by a single careless word. Clara, she decided, warranted further observation. The visit drew to a close, and Miss Marple rose, thanking Clara for her hospitality. "You've a lovely collection," she said, gesturing to the clocks. "Mr. Thorne's legacy lives on in them." Clara's smile was tight, her hand once more at her locket. "Indeed," she said, "I treasure them." As Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, she glanced back at the manor, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Clara Henshaw, she thought, was a woman of means and motive, but the mechanism of the crime, the locked door, the window, the pendulum, required a precision she was not yet certain Clara possessed. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she sifted through the day's findings. Clara's argument with Thorn, her obsession with the chronos, her maid's nervous demeanor, all were pieces of the puzzle, but they did not yet align. The buyer's bargain, she mused, was not just for a clock, but for a legacy, and such stakes could drive a heart to darkness. As the village clock chimed the hour, its solitary note a reminder of Thorn's silence, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Gideon Blackwood, the rival whose envy might hold the next key to the truth. Chapter 6. The Rival's Envy. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a sky of unbroken gray, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, boarded the early bus to Upper Wren, a market town some 5 miles distant, where Gideon Blackwood kept his clockmaker's shop. Her ostensible purpose was to inquire about a mantel clock for her nephew Raymond, but her true aim was to observe the man whose rivalry with Elias Thorne had been the talk of 2 villages. The bus rattled along the winding lanes, its windows fogged with the breath of its few passengers, and Miss Marple, her basket resting on her lap, gazed out at the hedgerows, her mind as sharp as the needles tucked within her knitting. Upper Wren was a busier place than St. Mary Mead, its streets lined with shops and the clamor of market day. Blackwood's shop, a narrow building squeezed between a bakery and a cobbler, bore a faded sign proclaiming, "G. Blackwood, Clocks and Watches." The window displayed a modest array of timepieces, their faces serviceable, but lacking the elegance of Thorne's creations. Miss Marple pushed open the door, a bell jingling overhead, and stepped into a space that felt cramped and shadowed, as if reflecting the disposition of its owner. The air smelled of dust and metal, and the tick of clocks was a disjointed chorus, lacking the harmony of Thorne's workshop. Gideon Blackwood emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth stained with oil. He was a broad man, his face weathered by years of labor, his eyes deep-set and guarded. "Good morning," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "Looking for a clock, are you?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of mild interest. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood. I've a nephew in London who fancies a mantel clock, and I thought to see what you might have." She gestured toward a small brass clock on a shelf, its design competent but uninspired. "You've a fine selection," she added, her tone encouraging. Gideon's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "I do my best," he said, setting the cloth aside. Not like Thorne's, mind you. He had a way with gears most of us can only dream of. His words carried a grudging respect, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of bitterness, like a sour note in a melody. She moved closer to the shelf, her fingers brushing the clock as if appraising it. "A terrible loss, Mr. Thorne," she said softly. "I understand you were in St. Mary Mead the evening he died. Such a shock for us all." Gideon's jaw tightened, his hands pausing mid-motion. "Was I?" he said, his tone guarded. "I might have been. Had business with a client there, but I was home by nightfall. My wife can tell you." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she drew her knitting from her basket, the familiar rhythm setting the stage for her questions. "Of course," she said, "though I heard you were seen near Thorne's workshop around 9. Miss Price, you know, has quite the eye for detail." She smiled, her eyes gentle but unyielding, watching for his reaction. A flush crept up Gideon's neck, and he turned to adjust a clock on the counter, his movements brusque. "Miss Price sees shadows in every corner," he muttered. "I might have passed by, but I didn't linger, had no reason to." Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering his words. "No reason, indeed," she said. "Though I've heard Mr. Thorne was working on something remarkable, a clock called the Chronos. They say it could have changed the trade. You must have been curious, being in the same line of work." Gideon's hand stilled, his eyes narrowing. "Heard about that, did you?" he said, his voice low. "Thorne was always boasting about his next big design, said it had put the rest of us out of business. But he never showed it, not to me." His tone was laced with resentment, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clenched the cloth, as if strangling a thought. She recalled a tradesman in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who'd sabotaged a rival's garden to win a village prize, his envy a slow poison that had betrayed him in a careless boast. Gideon, she suspected, carried a similar burden. The shop door opened, admitting Mrs. Blackwood, a slight woman with a pinched face and hands that twisted nervously at her apron. "Oh, Gideon, I didn't know you had a customer," she said, her voice tremulous. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, noting the woman's hesitation, the way her eyes darted to her husband before settling on the floor. "Just browsing, Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said. "Your husband's clocks are quite charming. I was just saying how sad it is about Mr. Thorne. You must have been home together that evening, I suppose, after Gideon's walk in St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Blackwood's hands froze, her gaze flickering to Gideon. Yes, he was home," she said too quickly. "Back by 10, weren't you, dear?" Gideon nodded, his expression unreadable, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in Mrs. Blackwood's voice, the uncertainty that lingered like a misaligned gear. She glanced at the coat rack by the door, where Gideon's heavy overcoat hung, its hem caked with mud that matched the rich loam of St. Mary Mead's gardens. A walk, she thought, could cover many sins. The conversation turned to the mantel clock, and Miss Marple feigned indecision, allowing Gideon to expound on its features. His knowledge was sound, but his passion was muted, as if his craft were a duty rather than a joy. She thought of Thorne's workshop, alive with the spark of creation, and the contrast was stark. Gideon's envy, she suspected, was not merely professional, but deeply personal, a wound festered by years of comparison. The Chronos, with its promise of revolution, would have been a bitter pill for a man already struggling to keep pace. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the door, her eyes lingering on the muddy coat. "The lanes must be treacherous after the rain," she said, her tone casual. "I notice the soil in St. Mary Mead clings to one's boots. You must find it a nuisance, coming and going." Gideon's face darkened, but he said nothing, and Mrs. Blackwood's hands twisted tighter in her apron. Miss Marple smiled, thanking them for their time, and stepped out into the drizzle, her mind alight with new threads. The bus ride back to St. Mary Mead gave her time to reflect. Gideon's bitterness, his presence near the workshop, the mud on his coat, all pointed to opportunity and motive. The Chronos, she suspected, was the spark that had ignited his envy, a design that threatened to eclipse his own modest achievements. Yet the locked door and the heavy pendulum weight puzzled her still. Could Gideon, with his sturdy frame, have climbed through the high window? Or was there another path, hidden like the gears of a clock? She recalled a case in her youth, when a jealous farmer had poisoned a rival's cattle, his guilt betrayed by the mud on his boots, tracked from a field he claimed not to have visited. Gideon, she decided, was a man to watch closely. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she sifted through the day's observations. The rival's envy was a powerful force, but it was the details, the mud, the hesitant wife, the guarded words, that would reveal the truth. As the village clock chimed, its solitary note a reminder of Thorne's silenced workshop, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Miss Evelyn Price, whose watchful eyes might hold the final piece of the puzzle. Chapter 7. The Neighbor's Vigil. The drizzle that had begun in Upper Wren followed Miss Jane Marple back to St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft veil of mist that muffled its usual hum. The high street, now slick with rain, reflected the dim glow of lamplights as evening approached, and the villagers hurried about their tasks with heads bowed against the weather. Miss Marple, her umbrella tilted against the damp, made her way to the cottage of Miss Evelyn Price, whose garden shared a wall with Elias Thorne's workshop. Her ostensible purpose was to borrow a cutting of Evelyn's prized lavender, but her true intent was to probe the observations of the village's most vigilant watcher. Miss Marple knew that Evelyn's penchant for gossip, like a clock's chime, could be both a nuisance and a revelation, depending on how one listened. Miss Price's cottage was a tidy affair, its whitewashed walls bright even in the gloom, its windows adorned with lace curtains that twitched at the slightest movement outside. The garden, a patchwork of marigolds, roses, and lavender, was Evelyn's pride, tended with a zeal that rivaled her love of village secrets. As Miss Marple knocked, the door flew open almost at once, revealing Evelyn in a floral apron, her sharp features alight with eagerness. "Miss Marple, oh, do come in. You'll catch your death in this rain," she exclaimed, ushering her guest into a parlor cluttered with knickknacks and the faint scent of potpourri. A small clock, one of Thorne's simpler designs, ticked on the mantel, its rhythm a quiet echo of the workshop next door. "I thought I might trouble you for a lavender cutting," Miss Marple said, settling into a chintz-covered chair, her basket at her side. "Yours is the finest in the village, and my garden could use a touch of its charm." Evelyn beamed, her bird-like eyes bright with flattery. "Oh, you're too kind. I'll fetch one directly, but first let me get you some tea. Such a dreadful business with poor Mr. Thorne, isn't it? I've hardly slept, thinking of it." Her voice, high and rapid, carried the thrill of one who thrived on drama. And Miss Marple smiled, drawing her knitting from her basket to set the stage for a longer conversation. As Evelyn bustled to the kitchen, Miss Marple surveyed the room. The parlor was a museum of village life, its shelves lined with photographs, trinkets, and a notebook that lay open on a side table, its pages filled with neat, cramped handwriting. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, suspecting it contained Evelyn's meticulous record of the village's comings and goings. She recalled a spinster in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who'd kept a diary of her neighbor's habits, unwittingly documenting a burglary that had baffled the local constable. Evelyn, she thought, was cut from similar cloth, her vigilance a double-edged sword that could cut through to the truth or obscure it with embellishment. Evelyn returned with a tray of tea and biscuits, her chatter resuming as she poured. "I saw it all, you know," she said, her tone conspiratorial. "That evening, before poor Mr. Thorne was found, I was in my garden tending the marigolds, and I saw Mrs. Henshaw leave the workshop just after 7, looking cross as anything. Then young Tom Weaver, he came out at 8, practically running. He was in such a hurry. And Mr. Blackwood, oh, he was lurking near the shop around 9, looking shifty, if you ask me." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "And later, past 10, I saw a shadow in my garden, moving near the wall. Gave me such a fright, I nearly dropped my trowel." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was sifting through Evelyn's words with precision. "A shadow," she repeated, her tone gentle. "How curious. Could you make out who it was?" Evelyn shook her head, her lips pursed. "No, it was too dark, and the mist was coming in. But it moved quick, like someone who didn't want to be seen. I told Constable Reed, of course, but he didn't seem to think much of it." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the trampled marigolds she'd seen beneath the workshop's window, the latter leaning against Evelyn's shed. A shadow, she mused, could be a thief, a murderer, or merely a trick of the light, but it was a detail worth pursuing. "Yours is a fine vantage point," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "Your garden overlooks the workshop so clearly. You must see all sorts of things." Evelyn preened, clearly pleased. "Oh, I do. I keep an eye out, you know, for the good of the village. Mr. Thorne was always so busy, people coming and going at all hours. He was working on something special, he told me once. A clock he called the Chronos. Said it would put St. Mary Mead on the map." Her voice dropped, as if sharing a confidence. "He kept it secret, though. Didn't even let Tom see it proper." Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. The Chronos again, its name a thread weaving through every account. "How fascinating," she said. "Did he ever mention why it was so special?" Evelyn shook her head, her fingers fidgeting with a biscuit. "Not in detail. Just said it was a new kind of mechanism, something no one had done before. I saw him sketching at his bench sometimes, through the window, but he'd cover it up quick if he thought anyone was watching." The conversation paused as Evelyn fetched the lavender cutting, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to step outside, ostensibly to admire the garden. The rain had eased, leaving the air fresh and the ground soft. She wandered toward the wall that bordered Thorne's workshop, her eyes scanning the marigolds. The patch beneath the high window was indeed disturbed, the flowers bent and broken as if trodden upon. She crouched, her fingers brushing the soil, which was looser here, as if recently turned. The ladder, propped against the shed, was sturdy, its rungs worn but clean, save for a faint smear of mud near the top. Miss Marple straightened, her mind turning over the possibilities. A ladder, a window, a shadow. Each suggested a path into the locked workshop, a path someone had taken with care. Back inside, Evelyn resumed her chatter, recounting the village's reactions to the murder. Miss Marple listened, her needles a steady rhythm, but her thoughts were on the garden. Evelyn's vigilance was a treasure trove, but it was also a filter, colored by her love of drama. The shadow she'd seen could be significant, or it could be a cat prowling among the flowers. Yet the trampled marigolds and the ladder pointed to something more tangible, a clue that aligned with the workshop's high window. Miss Marple recalled a case in her youth when a nosy neighbor had witnessed a theft but misjudged the hour, nearly sending an innocent man to jail. Evelyn, she decided, was a witness to be handled with care. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple thanked Evelyn for the lavender and the tea, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "You've a keen eye, Miss Price," she said. "The village is lucky to have you watching over it." Evelyn flushed with pride, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her hands fluttered, as if anxious to share more. Stepping into the evening mist, Miss Marple glanced back at the cottage, its windows glowing like eyes in the dusk. The neighbor's vigil had revealed much, a timeline, a shadow, a trampled garden, but it had also raised questions. Was Evelyn merely a watcher, or did her proximity to the crime conceal a deeper role? Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting a familiar companion as she sifted through the day's findings. Evelyn's account, with its precise details and theatrical flair, was a piece of the puzzle, but it lacked the clarity of truth. The chronos, the ladder, the shadow, all pointed to a crime that was both calculated and desperate. As the village clock chimed, its solitary note a reminder of Thorne's silenced workshop, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next step, piecing together the mechanism of the murder and the heart that had set it in motion. Chapter 8. The Chronos Design. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet that seemed to hold its breath, the mist of the day giving way to a clear, starry sky. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor at Danemead Cottage, the glow of the fire casting soft shadows across the walls. Her knitting lay in her lap, but her hands were still, her mind turning over the intricate puzzle of Elias Thorne's murder. The threads she had gathered, Tom's ambition, Clara's greed, Gideon's envy, Evelyn's vigilance, wove a pattern. But it was the Chronos design, that singular sketch on Thorne's workbench, that held the center of the tapestry. Its significance, Miss Marple sensed, was the key to unlocking the truth, and tonight she intended to fit another piece into place. The workshop's details haunted her. The locked door with its unique key, the high window overlooking Evelyn's garden, the bloodied pendulum weight that belonged to no clock in the shop. And then there was the Chronos, its intricate diagram hinting at a mechanism beyond ordinary timekeeping. Miss Marple, though no expert in horology, had a passing knowledge gleaned from her nephew Raymond's brief obsession with antique clocks. The Chronos, with its lattice of gears and peculiar annotations, suggested an escapement of unprecedented precision, perhaps one that could maintain accuracy without winding for days, even weeks. Such an innovation, she mused, would be a prize worth stealing, or killing for. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and moved to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for such occasions. In her neat, spidery hand, she jotted down the facts. Tom's frustration with Thorne's secrecy, Clara's argument over the Chronos, Gideon's presence near the workshop, Evelyn's shadow in the garden. Each suspect had a connection to the design, whether through ambition, desire, or envy. Yet the locked room puzzled her still. The key, untouched in the lock, ruled out a simple exit, and the window, high and narrow, demanded agility and intent. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a locked granary had concealed a smuggler's entry through a hidden panel. The principle, she thought, might apply here, though the workshop offered no such obvious deceit. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dolly Bantry, her face flushed with the chill of the evening, bustled in, her eyes bright with news. "Jane, you'll never guess," she exclaimed, settling into an armchair. "Constable Reed's been poking about the workshop again, and he says there's talk of sending the Chronos sketch to a London expert. They think it might be why Thorne was killed." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her mind already turning over the implications. "How interesting," she said, her tone mild. "And what does the village make of it?" Dolly leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Oh, they're all aflutter. Some say Tom wanted the design for himself, to start his own shop. Others think Mrs. Henshaw was furious when Thorne wouldn't sell it to her. And there's talk about Gideon Blackwood. Apparently, he's been struggling to keep his shop afloat, and Thorne's success was eating at him. As for Miss Price, well, she's telling everyone about that shadow in her garden, but no one takes her seriously." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant but sharp. "People do talk," she said, "but it's the quiet details that often speak loudest." She thought of the workshop's high window, the trampled marigolds, the ladder in Evelyn's shed. The Chronos sketch, with its faint pencil marks, suggested a design not yet complete, perhaps hidden or copied to protect its secrets. Miss Marple's mind flitted to the misplaced clock in the workshop, its base revealing a faint outline in the dust. Could it have concealed a second sketch, or perhaps a notebook detailing the Chronos's mechanism? And the pendulum weight, so incongruous in its size, hinted at a deliberate choice, a weapon seized in haste or calculation. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "did Constable Reed mention anything else about the workshop? A missing item, perhaps, or something out of place?" Dolly frowned, tapping her chin. "Not that I recall, but he did say the desk was locked tight, and they couldn't find the key. They're planning to break it open tomorrow, see if there's anything inside." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. A locked desk, she thought, was a treasure chest of possibilities, and its contents might confirm her suspicions about the Chronos. As Dolly chattered on, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the suspects. Tom's ambition could have driven him to steal the design, but his nervous demeanor suggested fear rather than cunning. Clara's greed was palpable, her passion for clocks bordering on obsession, yet her wealth made violence seem an unlikely recourse. Gideon's envy, stoked by years of rivalry, was a darker motive, and his muddy coat hinted at a nocturnal visit to St. Mary Mead. Evelyn, with her watchful eyes, might have seen more than she admitted, her proximity to the workshop a convenience too neat to ignore. The Chronos, Miss Marple decided, was the pivot on which the crime turned, its value not merely financial but professional, a legacy that could elevate or destroy. She rose, offering Dolly a cup of tea to prolong the visit. "It's a curious thing, a locked room," she said, her tone conversational. "It makes one think of old stories, thieves slipping through hidden passages, or keys turned to mislead. Dolly's eyes widened. Her love of drama piqued. "You think there's a trick to it, Jane? Like in one of Raymond's novels?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Life, Dolly, is often stranger than novels, but it follows its own logic. We need only find the right thread." As Dolly departed, Miss Marple returned to her notebook, adding a new entry. "Locked desk, key missing. Kronos sketch, unique or copied." She thought of the workshop's window, the ladder, the shadow Evelyn had seen. A plan began to form, a way to test the gears of the case. If the Kronos was indeed the motive, its allure might yet draw the killer out. She would speak to Constable Reed, suggest a rumor that the sketch had been sent to London, a bait to stir the guilty into action. The truth, she knew, was like a clock's mechanism, hidden until the right moment when every gear aligned. As the village clock chimed, its solitary note a reminder of Thorne's silenced workshop, Miss Marple set her notebook aside. The Kronos design was the heart of the mystery, and its secrets would not remain locked forever. With a quiet resolve, she turned her thoughts to the next step, ready to wind the springs of truth a little tighter. Chapter 9. A Trap. Set. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a pale, hesitant light, as if the village itself were reluctant to face another day shadowed by murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out her window at the mist curling through the hedgerows. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquil scene, turning over the intricate machinery of Elias Thorne's death. The Kronos design, with its promise of horological revolution, had emerged as the fulcrum of the case, its allure a magnet for ambition, greed, and envy. The locked workshop, the high window, the trampled marigolds, and the misplaced pendulum weight all pointed to a crime both calculated and desperate. Today, Miss Marple resolved to set a trap, a delicate mechanism to coax the truth from the shadows. Her plan was simple yet precise, like the escapement of a well-crafted clock. She would plant a rumor that the Kronos sketch had been found intact and was being sent to a London expert for evaluation, its secrets poised to be revealed. Such news, she reasoned, would unsettle the killer, who likely believed the design secure or destroyed. A guilty conscience, she knew from long experience, was a restless thing, prone to action when cornered. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a whispered rumor about a stolen brooch had flushed out a thief caught red-handed trying to retrieve it from a hiding place. The principle, she trusted, would hold here. After breakfast, Miss Marple donned her coat and scarf, her basket tucked under her arm, and made her way to the village tea shop, a hub of gossip where news spread faster than the post. Mrs. Polk, the proprietress, greeted her with a knowing smile, her apron dusted with flour. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands. "Terrible business about Mr. Thorne. Have you heard anything new?" Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her knitting a familiar prop as she leaned forward, her voice low but clear. "Indeed, Mrs. Polk. I've just spoken to Dolly Bantry, and it seems Constable Reed has found something remarkable in the workshop, a sketch of Thorne's final design, the Kronos. They're sending it to London for appraisal. Quite valuable, I'm told." Mrs. Polk's eyes widened, her hands pausing mid-wipe. "London, you say? Well, that's news. I'll wager it's what got poor Mr. Thorne killed." She bustled off to serve another customer, but Miss Marple knew the seed was planted. By noon, the rumor would be ticking through the village like a wound clock, reaching the ears of Tom Weaver, Clara Henshaw, Gideon Blackwood, and Evelyn Price. She sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the tea shops, patrons noting their hushed whispers and furtive glances. The bait was set. Now she needed only to watch for the bite. Her next stop was the police station, a small brick building where Constable Reed presided with dogged determination. He welcomed her with a mix of respect and wariness, accustomed to her unerring knack for uncovering truths he missed. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled, her expression one of gentle concern. "I've been thinking about poor Mr. Thorne," she said, "and that sketch you found, the Chronos. I understand it's to be sent to London. Might it be wise to keep a close eye on the workshop tonight? Such a valuable item could attract unwanted attention." Reed's brow furrowed, but he nodded, catching her drift. "You think someone might try to snatch it? Well, it's locked up tight, but I'll have Perkins keep watch. Can't be too careful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Quite right, Constable. People can be so unpredictable when treasures are at stake." She left him with a plan forming, her suggestion planted as carefully as the rumor in the tea shop. Reed, she knew, was methodical, but not imaginative. He would guard the workshop, but it was her own vigil that would catch the guilty. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to Danemead Cottage, her mind alert to the rhythm of the village. The rumor had spread, as she'd hoped, and she sensed a tension in the air, like the tightening of a clock's spring. She dined lightly, then slipped into a dark shawl and sturdy shoes, her basket left behind for once. With Constable Reed's agreement, she positioned herself in the shadow of a yew tree across from Thorne's workshop, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the high street and Evelyn's garden. Perkins, the young constable, was stationed at the workshop door, his lantern casting a faint glow. Miss Marple, hidden in the darkness, waited with the patience of one who understood the slow tick of time. The village clock struck 11, its chime a solitary note in the stillness. The mist had returned, curling around the lampposts, and the high street was deserted save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite the gloom, fixed on the workshop's window, its narrow frame barely visible above Evelyn's garden wall. She thought of the ladder, the trampled marigolds, the shadow Evelyn had seen. If her trap worked, the killer would come, drawn by the fear that the Chronos' secrets were slipping away. At 11:30, a figure emerged from the mist, moving with a stealth that belied its bulk. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognized Gideon Blackwood, his broad shoulders unmistakable even in the dim light. He carried a satchel, its weight pulling at his arm, and his steps were cautious, skirting the edge of Evelyn's garden. He paused at the shed, his hands fumbling in the darkness, and Miss Marple saw the faint outline of the ladder as he drew it out. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her presence as unnoticed as a shadow. Gideon propped the ladder against the wall, its rungs creaking softly as he climbed. The workshop window, unlatched as Reed had left it under her suggestion, yielded to his touch. He slipped inside with surprising agility, his satchel slung over his shoulder. Miss Marple signaled to Perkins, who had been briefed to wait for her cue. The young constable moved swiftly, his lantern doused, and entered the workshop through the door, which Reed had unlocked for the purpose. A muffled shout followed, then the sound of a scuffle, and moments later, Perkins emerged with Gideon in tow, his hands bound and his face a mask of fury. Miss Marple stepped forward, her shawl blending with the mist. "Well done, Constable," she said, her voice calm but firm. Gideon's eyes widened at the sight of her, a mix of shock and defiance in his gaze. "What's this about, Miss Marple?" he demanded, but his voice faltered. She tilted her head, her expression one of quiet certainty. "You were looking for the Kronos sketch, I presume," she said. "It's safe, but your presence here speaks volumes." Reed arrived, summoned by Perkins, and took charge of Gideon, who protested his innocence with diminishing conviction. A search of his satchel revealed a small crowbar and a folded cloth, likely intended to wrap the sketch. Miss Marple's trap had worked, the rumor drawing Gideon out as surely as a chime signals the hour. As he was led away, she returned to her cottage, the night's chill seeping into her bones, but her mind alight with satisfaction. The trap had sprung, but the full truth remained just out of reach, waiting for the final turn of the key. Chapter 10. The Confession. The morning after Gideon Blackwood's apprehension dawned crisp and clear. The mist of the previous night burned away by a sun that cast St. Mary Mead in a deceptive glow of normalcy. The village, however, buzzed with the news of the arrest, whispers darting from shop to shop like errant sparks. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor with a cup of tea, her knitting idle in her lap, reflected on the trap that had sprung so neatly. Gideon's nocturnal venture to the workshop, lured by the rumor of the Kronos sketch's dispatch to London, had confirmed her suspicions, but the mechanism of the crime, the locked door, the high window, the heavy pendulum weight, still required a final alignment. Today, she trusted, the truth would tick into place. Constable Reed had summoned her to the police station, a gesture she knew stemmed from both respect and exasperation at her uncanny knack for unraveling mysteries. She donned her coat and scarf, her basket left behind, and made her way to the small brick building where Gideon awaited questioning. The station was a modest affair, its single interrogation room smelling of ink and damp plaster. Reed greeted her with a nod, his face etched with the strain of a case that had stretched his modest talents. "Miss Marple," he said, "Blackwood's been tight-lipped, but he's shaken. I thought you might have a word." She smiled, her expression serene, but her eyes sharp. "Of course, Constable. Sometimes a quiet chat can set things right." Reed led her to the room where Gideon sat, his broad frame slumped in a wooden chair, his hands cuffed before him. His weathered face was pale, his eyes darting with a mix of defiance and fear. A satchel, its contents laid out on the table, crowbar, cloth, and a small flashlight, bore witness to his intent. Miss Marple settled opposite him, her posture that of a kindly aunt, though her gaze held the precision of a watchmaker's loop. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice soft but deliberate. "It's a sad business, this. Poor Mr. Thorne, struck down in his prime, and now you, caught in his workshop. I wonder what drew you there last night?" Gideon's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the table. "I told Reed," he muttered. "I was just curious. Heard about that sketch going to London. Thought I'd have a look. No harm in it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle skepticism. "Curiosity is a powerful thing," she said. "But to climb a ladder in the dead of night, with a crowbar no less, that speaks of more than idle interest." Gideon shifted, his cuffs clinking softly. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice low but insistent. I just wanted the Chronos. Thorn was always lording it over me, his designs, his reputation. That clock, it was his crowning glory, and I wanted to see it, maybe borrow it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. Borrow it, she repeated, her tone inviting further confession. A design like that could change a man's fortunes, could it not? Especially for one whose shop struggles against such a rival. The words struck a nerve, and Gideon's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening. Struggling, aye, he admitted, his voice bitter. Thorn took my clients, my standing. Every clock he made put mine in the shade. When I heard about the Chronos, I knew it'd finish me. A mechanism that could run for weeks without winding. Revolutionary, they said. I had to have it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over his words. She recalled a village craftsman years ago, driven to sabotage a rival's loom out of envy, his confession spilling forth under the weight of his own guilt. Gideon, she sensed, was nearing a similar breaking point. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. So, you went to the workshop that night, didn't you? Not last night, but the night Mr. Thorn died. You were seen near the shop, your coat muddy from the garden. Gideon's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face. Who said that? He demanded, but his bravado faltered. Miss Marple's gaze held his, steady and unyielding. The village sees much, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Price's garden, for instance, those trampled marigolds beneath the workshop window, and your coat with mud to match. Tell me, how did you get in? He slumped further, his defiance crumbling like a rusted gear. The ladder, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I took it from Price's shed, climbed to the window. It was unlatched. Thorn never locked it, thought no one would bother with the height. I went in around 9, after I saw Weaver and Mrs. Henshaw leave. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. And what happened then? She asked, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. Gideon's hands trembled, his eyes distant with the memory. I confronted him, asked to see the Chronos, said I'd pay for a look, even a copy. He laughed at me, said I'd never match his skill, that the Chronos was his alone. I got angry, grabbed the pendulum weight from the bench. It was just there, heavy, wrong for the clocks he had. I didn't mean to kill him, I swear. I swung it just to scare him, but it hit his head, and he fell. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, the cuffs clinking with the motion. Miss Marple sat back, her mind aligning the final gears. The locked door, she realized, had been a matter of chance. And after? She prompted gently. Gideon's voice was a whisper. I panicked, locked the door from inside with his key, climbed back out the window, put the ladder back, thought the locked room would throw them off, make it look like, I don't know, an accident. He looked up, his eyes pleading. I didn't want him dead, Miss Marple. I just wanted the Chronos. She nodded, her expression one of quiet compassion, though her mind was cataloging the details. The ladder, the window, the locked door, all fit his account, and the pendulum weight, an impromptu weapon, explained its incongruity. She recalled a case in her youth, when a man had killed in a moment of rage, his confession as much a relief to him as to the law. Gideon's story rang true, its pieces clicking into place like the gears of the Chronos itself. Constable Reed, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, his notebook open. That's enough, Blackwood, he said, his voice gruff but satisfied. You'll be charged, and we'll have the truth of it in court." He glanced at Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes. "You've a way with words, miss. Got him to talk when I couldn't." She smiled, rising from her chair. "People often need only a listener, Constable," she said. "The truth has a way of ticking free." As she left the station, the village clock struck noon, its chime a reminder of the rhythm restored. Gideon's confession had wound the case to its conclusion, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the Chronos, its secret safe for now. She stepped into the sunlight, her steps light but purposeful, ready to return to her knitting and the quiet of Danemead Cottage, where the next puzzle might already be waiting. Chapter 11. The Village Restored. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle warmth, as if the village, relieved of its burden of suspicion, had exhaled at last. The high street bustled with its usual rhythm, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, children scampering to school, and the postman making his rounds with a cheerful whistle. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet gratitude pulsed, for the shadow of Elias Thorne's murder had lifted, and the village could once again keep time with its familiar cadence. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her parlor window, watched the scene unfold, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands. The case, with its intricate gears of motive and opportunity, had wound to its close, and she felt the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved, tempered by the sadness of a life lost. The arrest of Gideon Blackwood had spread through St. Mary Mead like a chime, each villager adding their own note to the chorus of relief and speculation. By midday, the tea shop was abuzz with talk of his confession, his envy-driven act laid bare by Miss Marple's subtle trap. Constable Reed, though loath to admit it, had credited her insight, and Dolly Bantry, ever the herald of village news, had already visited Danemead Cottage to recount the latest gossip. "Jane, you're a marvel," she had exclaimed, settling into an armchair with a cup of tea. "To think Gideon climbed that ladder, all for a sketch, and the locked door, such a clever trick." Miss Marple had smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Clever, perhaps, but desperate," she said. "Envy is a heavy weight, Dolly, and it can make even a steady man falter." Her thoughts returned to the workshop, the high window, the trampled marigolds, and the Chronos sketch that had sparked such fatal desire. The design, now safely in Constable Reed's hands, was to be sent to a reputable clockmaker in London, a Mr. Hargreaves, who had promised to complete Thorne's work and ensure his legacy endured. Miss Marple found comfort in that, for a craftsman's art deserved to outlive his tragedy. The village, too, was finding its way back to equilibrium. Tom Weaver, cleared of suspicion, had taken up the mantle of Thorne's workshop, his lanky frame often seen through the window, bent over the workbench with a new-found determination. Miss Marple had visited him the previous day, under the guise of collecting her repaired clock. "You'll do Mr. Thorne proud, Tom," she had said, noting the earnest set of his jaw. "He taught you well." Tom had nodded, his eyes bright with purpose. "I'll try, Miss Marple. I want to finish what he started, maybe even the Chronos, if Mr. Hargreaves allows it." She had smiled, sensing in him the spark of ambition tempered by respect, a far cry from the reckless envy that had undone Gideon. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, ever the collector, had wasted no time in securing the completed Chronos clock from Hargreaves's workshop once it was ready. Miss Marple had heard from Dolly that Clara had paid a princely sum, her pride undimmed by the scandal. At a recent church fundraiser, Clara had displayed the clock in her Manners drawing room, its intricate mechanism drawing gasps from the villagers. A fitting tribute to Elias, she had declared, though Miss Marple noted the possessive gleam in her eye, as if the clock were a trophy won rather than a legacy shared. Still, she thought, Clara's greed had been confined to coin, not blood, and the village could forgive her that. Miss Evelyn Price, true to form, had not ceased her watchfulness, though she had promised at the vicarage tea to curb her gossip. "I'll keep my eyes to my garden from now on," she had said, her tone earnest but unconvincing. Miss Marple, sipping tea at the event, had caught Evelyn noting the comings and goings of the guests, her notebook tucked discreetly in her apron. Some habits, Miss Marple mused, were as fixed as the stars, and Evelyn's vigilance, while tiresome, was part of the village's rhythm. She recalled a nosy neighbor from her youth, whose idle chatter had once led to the recovery of a lost child, proof that even the busiest tongues could serve a purpose. Constable Reed, meanwhile, had gained a measure of confidence from the case, though he remained as methodical as ever. He had called on Miss Marple that morning, his hat in hand, to thank her for her assistance. "You've a knack, miss," he said, a grudging smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "I'd have been chasing shadows without you." She had waved off the compliment, her eyes twinkling. "Nonsense, Constable. You'd have found the truth in time. I only helped wind the clock a bit faster." Reed had chuckled, a rare sound, and left with a promise to keep her apprised of Gideon's trial. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked to the high street, her steps slow but purposeful, to see the workshop's sign relit, its gilt letters gleaming under a new lantern Tom had installed. The chime of a clock, one of Thorne's simpler designs, rang out, a tentative note that promised to grow stronger with time. The village, she thought, was like a clock itself, its gears realigned after a disruption, ticking steadily toward tomorrow. She paused by the workshop, her eyes lingering on the high window, now securely latched, and the garden wall where the ladder had stood. The mechanism of the crime had been simple in the end. A moment of rage, a desperate climb, a locked door to mislead, but it had taken patience to see it clear. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed as the village clock struck 6. The case of the murdered clockmaker was closed, its pieces fitted together with the precision of Thorne's own craft. Yet she knew St. Mary Mead would always hold new puzzles, new springs to unwind. For now, though, she was content to let the village tick on, its rhythm restored, its secrets safe until the next chime called her to listen. Chapter 12. Reflections by the Fire. The autumn evening wrapped St. Mary Mead in a gentle hush, the last leaves of the season drifting past the lamplights like fleeting thoughts. Inside Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her fireside, the glow casting a warm circle around her armchair. Her knitting, a soft gray scarf for her nephew Raymond, lay in her lap, its needles stilled as she gazed into the flames. The case of Elias Thorne's murder had wound to its close, its gears aligned with the precision of the clockmaker's own craft. Yet, as was her habit, Miss Marple turned the events over in her mind, not out of doubt, but from a quiet need to understand the human heart that had set the tragedy in motion. The fire crackled, its rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The Chronos design, that intricate sketch of unparalleled ingenuity, had been the spark, igniting Gideon Blackwood's envy, tempting Clara Henshaw's greed, stirring Tom Weaver's ambition and feeding Evelyn Price's curiosity. Each suspect, Miss Marple reflected, was a cog in the village's mechanism, their desires ticking in concert until one fatal misalignment had brought death to the workshop. She thought of Gideon, his broad hands trembling as he confessed, driven not by malice, but by a desperate need to outshine his rival. Envy, she mused, was a silent force, like a spring overwound, capable of breaking the strongest frame. She reached for her tea, its steam curling in the firelight, and considered the locked room that had so puzzled Constable Reed. The high window, the ladder from Evelyn's shed, the key left in the lock. It was a simple trick in the end, born of panic rather than cunning. Miss Marple recalled a case from her girlhood when a village lad had locked a shed to hide stolen apples, slipping out through a loose board to confound pursuit. The principle was the same. A locked door was not a barrier but a deception, and Gideon's hasty exit had left traces, the trampled marigolds, the muddy coat that her patient eye had caught. Her thoughts drifted to the other players in the drama. Tom Weaver, now tending the workshop with a new-found reverence, had been spared the stain of suspicion, his ambition tempered by the loss of his mentor. Clara Henshaw, her pride assuaged by the acquisition of the Chronos, would continue to reign over her manor, her clocks ticking in smug satisfaction. Evelyn Price, despite her promises, would no doubt watch the village with undimmed zeal, her notebook ever at hand. Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling a vicar's wife from years past, whose gossip had unraveled a petty theft, but also sowed discord. People, she knew, were as predictable as clockwork, yet their complexities never ceased to surprise. The village clock struck 7, its chime clear and steady, a testament to Tom's care in restoring Thorne's legacy. Miss Marple set her tea down, her fingers tracing the soft wool of the scarf. The case had been a delicate mechanism, each clue a gear that needed only the right touch to align. The Chronos, now in the hands of a London craftsman, would carry Thorne's name forward, a fitting tribute to a man whose art had measured the village's days. Yet Miss Marple felt a pang for the cost of it all. A life ended, a rival broken, a community shaken. Human nature, she thought, was the true escapement, releasing its energies in ways both beautiful and terrible. She rose, placing the scarf on the table, and moved to the window, where the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled in the gathering dusk. The village was at peace, its rhythm restored, but Miss Marple knew that peace was fleeting. Another puzzle would come, another spring to unwind, and she would be ready, her quiet watchfulness as constant as the stars. For now, though, she returned to her chair, her knitting resumed, its gentle click a promise that time and truth would always find their way.